Welcome to today's webinar, Protect the Data, Not Just the Perimeter, Securing Critical Infrastructure in the Age of AI. I'm Val Moon with the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, or ICIT. ICIT's mission is to modernize, secure, and make resilient critical infrastructure that provides for people's foundational needs. By applying a people-centric lens to critical infrastructure research and decision-making, our work ensures that modernization and security investments have a lasting positive impact on society. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Daniela Lulli from Varonis, a leader in data security that is challenging conventional cybersecurity thinking. Today's discussion is especially timely. As organizations rapidly adopt AI and cloud technologies, we're seeing a growing disconnect between how security has traditionally been designed and how data is actually being accessed, shared, and exploited. That's where Varonis brings a fundamentally different perspective, one that focuses in on protecting the data itself rather than just building walls around infrastructure. To start, I'd like Daniela Lulli to introduce herself and then briefly talk about Varonis's approach to security and explain what they mean by protecting data first, not last. Over to you.
Great. Thanks again for having me today, Val. Just to introduce myself to everyone, I work with large organizations, large enterprises across the Mid-Atlantic region, helping them solve data and AI security problems. I've been at Varonis for just almost 4 years now. I've spent a lot of time working with organizations, across the enterprise space, as well as the Department of Defense, the Defense Industrial Base, UN, NATO, so a wide variety of organizations. And, to share a little bit about kind of what we mean by protecting data first and not last, I want to start by sharing a quick story with how Varonis was actually founded. So 20 years ago, the CEO of Varonis, Yaki Feidelson, worked at NetApp. He was working with a customer, a large oil company, who had invested millions of dollars in having high value images of the bottom of the ocean. And one day, those images disappeared. And when they went to the NetApp team and they asked, where did they go? Can you help us find out what happened, where they moved, deleted? They weren't able to answer those questions. And that's when, Yaki realized that this was a big security problem and he needed to go solve it. So that's why he left and went to create Varonis. Fast forward 20 years, there are still a lot of other, most organizations are still struggling with those same problems. And they're outside of Varonis, there really aren't any technologies that allow you to answer those questions at scale across, hybrid environments. And again, this is something that I've seen as a gap across all the organizations that I've worked with. So to answer your question, protecting data first and not last, that's what the Varonis platform does. At a high level, our approach starts with finding where sensitive data exists and where it's at risk. We then use automation to fix risk, whether it's exposure, data accessible to the entire organization, sensitive data exposed publicly. We actually use automation to lock those risks down at scale across hybrid environments without impacting operations. So we find the data, we find where there's risks, we fix it, and then we monitor data level activity and perform user and entity behavior analytics to detect and stop insider threats, compromised identities, and other threats within the network in real time. And so that's really what we mean when we say protecting data first and not last.
No, that's great, and thanks for sharing the origin story. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Let's zoom out for a moment. And from your perspective, like from your vantage point, what are the biggest cybersecurity challenges enterprises, especially those that are supporting critical infrastructure, what are they facing right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think AI is coming up in every single conversation we have. Everyone is struggling with it in some way. And I think the two biggest challenges that we're seeing are, first, most organizations, they don't actually know where or how AI is already being used within their environment, whether it's employees or business units or even embedded within vendor products. They just don't know. And second is they're struggling to figure out how to roll out generative AI solutions and other AI systems to reap the benefits of AI without introducing massive risk or potential operational disruption, which is of course especially important in the critical infrastructure sector. And we talked about Varonis's approach to security, right? It's data focused, data centric, and when you think about AI security, it's really the same as data security. So AI systems, co-pilots, agents, all of those systems are only as good as the data they have access to. And the reason why organizations are so concerned when it comes to using them is because they don't want to lose control over their data. They don't want it being accessed by the wrong people. They don't want it being leaked to attackers. They don't want it being manipulated in a way that could bring down physical systems. So the AI security problem is really, again, just a data security problem that they don't have a good way to solve. And the way that these agents and copilots are built is that they honor existing permissions. That's how they know what data to access and what data to use when responding to questions and perform tasks. And the problem is that those permissions those systems are using to the data are wide open. Varonis, we do thousands of data risk assessments every year. And every year we put together a data risk report based on 1,000 of real IT environments that we connected to. And just last year, we saw that 90% of organizations have sensitive data that's accessible to any person in the organization, and that the average user has access to over 25,000 folders that have sensitive data. So too many people have too much access to too much data, and as a result, so does Copilot, so does ChatGPT, so do the agents that teams are deploying. So again, to kind of answer your question, I think the biggest challenges that organizations are having is getting a grasp on what AI systems are being used, and understanding and putting safeguards in place to actually secure it and make sure that the risk surface and all the data that they have access to is minimal, so that there's no risk that they're opening the organization up to.
And that's actually some eye-opening stats that you're providing. I think, you might have already touched on some of this, as you see companies adopt AI into their business enterprises. Like, what do you think their security teams need to adjust? It sounds like one thing is that they don't really have a good idea of what these AI systems have, what permissions, right, they give users within the enterprise access to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think adjusting the way you identify and mitigate risk, I think those are the biggest gaps, because organizations really don't have a good handle on it right now. Understanding where the sensitive data is, how it's exposed to identities and non-human systems, and then having the monitoring controls in place at the data level. Like, those are all gaps that every organization we talk to has.
So I know some organizations might think, they're safer because they haven't rolled out some of these AI systems like Copilot. Is that actually true?
So I'd say no. Answer is twofold, because even without Copilot, there's different things that organizations are going to be using that they don't have visibility into, right? If you restrict Copilot, a user's going to go into the browser and try to use ChatGPT or OpenAI, those models. If you're blocking that with some kind of firewall level rule or a proxy based rule to block that access, they're going to go find some other LLM that's less well known, that isn't blocked, that's going to do the same job but is probably less secure. If you block that, they'll go to their personal devices. And even outside of that, developers are rolling out different agents to automate different workflows. And it's so easy to, with out of the box tools like Copilot Studio, for example, they have over 1,400 out-of-the-box connectors. So it's really, really easy to connect these systems to different data stores, in which all of them, the permissions are still excessive and they're sprawl everywhere. So I think sometimes restricting access can almost lead to more risks. Just as an example, let's say like organizations blocked use of Gemini and a lot of generative AI tools in the browser. And let's say a developer who wants to use Gemini, it's his LLM of choice to help with coding tasks. Let's say he logs into his personal computer and logs into his Gemini account. Let's say his credentials were to be compromised. The attacker then would have access to all of his conversation history. And that's something that organizations wouldn't have visibility into because it's his personal account. The attacker would see, all the code snippets that developer had uploaded, potentially from production systems. The attackers would see, potentially API tokens or service account keys if those are in the code somewhere. The attacker would have all the context and information about what the developer was working on, and probably also, information about the tools and processes that they're actually using in their production environment. That's a pretty great starting point for an attacker to take those systems down. So, we're really in a multi-AI era, and organizations and employees are using a wide variety of tools. And, I'd just say restricting things can lead to, potentially worse consequences. And, the better approach is to get visibility and put the safeguards in place to make sure that you're able to see how it's being used, and you're able to secure it.
No, that's actually a great example. So beyond these Gen AI tools, what are other AI related risks that organizations might not be thinking about?
Mhm. I would, I break down AI related risks into two categories. So first is the internal usage, how it's being used within organizations, and the second is how are attackers leveraging AI. So first, with internal usage, we've talked about generative AI. I've also talked a little bit about agentic AI, right, and the risks there, especially with the amount of overexposure that's typical in most environments. We also see that shadow AI is prevalent in last year's Varonis's 2025 security risk report. Across the 1,000 customers we worked with, 98% of them had employees using unsanctioned AI applications. Oftentimes, this shows up in the form of third-party OAuth applications that users can, in most environments, just add themselves. So just like you can add, a Calendly or Salesforce as a plugin to your Outlook account, for example, users can register other applications like Otter AI, DeepSeek, ChatGPT. They can add those applications with their work email, and in that process, they grant consent for the scope of permissions that that application requests, which obviously results in those third-party AI applications suddenly having access to all the information that that one user had access to. I think a good example here, late last year, there's a supply chain related example that I think is relevant. Scattered Spiders is a cyber criminal group. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, they're a very sophisticated, financially motivated group. And they were impersonating IT support and using vishing, or voice phishing, to social engineer employees to install a modified version of a legit Salesforce tool into their Salesforce tenants. And once that plugin was installed, the attackers had access to basically the entire Salesforce environment and all of the sensitive customer data there. So in that, when that campaign was happening, Google's own Salesforce environment was breached in about, I think, September of last year. And companies like Palo Alto, Zscaler, Tenable, Proofpoint, they were all impacted. And all of that just because of one third-party application that was added to their tenant. So that's just one example of one area where we're seeing kind of shadow AI, the unsanctioned third-party OAuth applications. There's other unsanctioned AI tools that we're seeing pop up, and whether it's business units spinning up and training their own LLMs. The risk there is the data it's being trained on. If it's training on bad data, that model could then make bad decisions based on that information, which could impact operations of a physical system potentially. There's also the risk of sensitive data being spit out to an end user if you train it on that sensitive data. And of course, for teams developing their own LLMs, there's always the risk of bad code, misconfigurations, which are just yet other vectors that could be exploited by a bad actor. So all of those are some of the other risks that we're seeing internally, internal usage of AI. On the other hand, that we also have how attackers are using AI and how that's enabling new attack vectors. So I think a big one on that side of things is prompt hacking. Copilot, Agentforce, other Gen AI tools out there, they've done a pretty good job of putting prompt safeguards in place. But at the end of the day, those safeguards aren't sufficient for motivated attackers. Just another example, just 2 weeks ago, Varonis Threat Labs, they discovered a way to bypass Copilot's safety controls by manipulating a simple URL. So in this case, the attack starts with an attacker sending a link to a user that has multiple prompt instructions within one of the URL parameters. And then if the user clicks on it, the attacker social engineers them, the user clicks on it, suddenly the attacker has an effective, persistent way to submit an ongoing chain of requests that Copilot isn't preventing. And the reason this is possible is because the safeguards Copilot had in place to prevent data exfiltration in this way only applied to the first prompt in the parameter sequence. So that's just one example, but these have been popping up frequently across all the different Gen AI tools out there, from Copilot, Gemini, all of them, and these are going to continue to evolve. So prompt hacking and is going to continue to evolve, and the safeguards are not always going to be effective. So that's one area where we're seeing a lot of risk on the attacker side. There's also, of course, the risk of model theft. Or an organization trains a model on sensitive data, that model gets stolen, that model could then be reverse engineered. The attacker could use prompt engineering to get some of the sensitive information it was trained on. That's another area. And I think the one other major area where we're seeing significant evolution is phishing and social engineering. Bad actors are using AI to become even more effective at hacking trust and stealing credentials than they've ever been in the past. They're using Worm GPT, Kawaii GPT to craft the best social engineering, business email compromise, and other phishing attacks that we have never seen before. These are consistently getting past both people and traditional email security tools. And the sophistication of social engineering has advanced to the point where attackers are literally joining Zoom calls with people and using deepfakes to impersonate trusted individuals and get them to do things. I think there's 2 years ago in 2024, a perfect example of this. There was a guy in Hong Kong. He was finance employee of a British engineering group called Arup. And this employee, he's in finance, received an email from an account claiming to be his CFO, and that account was requesting him to make a series of confidential transactions. And initially, he didn't trust it, but then he got on a Zoom call with a bunch of people who looked and sounded exactly like his CFO and that team, and they confirmed the ask to initiate the transactions, or the transfers. So this employee ended up making 15 transfers to 5 different bank accounts, and he wired a total of 25 million to the attackers in US dollars. So those are just some of the ways that we're seeing AI really enable a new breed of social engineering and other threats.
Wow, those are some very sobering stories that you're sharing.
Yeah.
So clearly the speed of AI adoption on the offensive side is really outpacing a lot of our traditional security models. So what's the solution? Like, what's the solution, especially when you consider critical infrastructure environments, right? Which we know already are really key targets, especially for nation state actors as well as criminal actors.
For sure. I mean, there's definitely things we can do. There's already a lot of regulations and security frameworks around AI that have already been kind of released and across the globe, and they're going to continue to evolve, of course. Things like NIST AIRMF, the EU AI Act, Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. There's lots of them, but they all really share the 3 same core components. Those are observability, remediation, and detection. Those are really the foundation of an effective solution. I think organizations can get overwhelmed with all of the problems that are arising with the use of AI, and they can tend to overcomplicate the approach or have blind spots. But the solution is pretty straightforward. So first step, observability. Getting visibility into all of the AI systems and applications currently in use. And along with that AI inventory, you need to understand the blast radius, all of the data that those systems can access. And you need to understand risks and misconfigurations associated with those systems. That's the first step, because you can't solve a problem if you don't know, if you don't know what it is. So first step is observability. Second step, remediation. You need to be able to lock down the blast radius and remediate the risk around those systems. You have to be able to restrict excessive permissions, restrict stale, globally excessive data, global or public links. Those need to be removed. You need to address the permission sprawl problem, and it has to be done with automation. There isn't enough time or resources in a day to keep up with, how quickly risk is growing every day. So first, find the problems, get the inventory, find the risk, remediate the risk, and the last piece is detection. You need real-time monitoring to effectively detect misuse or threats. You need to understand the prompts being generated. You need to understand the different workflows between agents and how those agents are interacting with each other as well as data. And you need some kind of monitoring and analysis technology to understand all the different data flows and interactions to detect, misuse of AI technology. So all of that to say, you need the ability to have observability, remediation, and detection. And if you're missing any one of those, then your security approach has gaps. And it's worth noting as well, relying on end users for any piece of this solution is not going to work, especially in critical infrastructure sector, operational environments that require 24/7 uptime. You need automation. If you don't have an automated solution, it will at some point fail. So you have to build it strongly from the ground up. And these 3 components that I've talked about for an effective solution, observability, remediation, detection, this is exactly what Varonis is doing. We've been solving these problems, data security problems, with the same approach for 20 years. And we've been helping organizations more recently with the same AI security problems. And just one example, just to paint the picture for how exactly we do this, There's a customer we have down south, over 10,000 users in that organization, highly regulated. They deal with a lot of sensitive health information. In theory, a lot of patient information is supposed to be stored in, dedicated EHR systems, but of course, the reality is that data ends up in a lot of places, and they don't have visibility into it. So this customer specifically, they had over 900,000 files with sensitive information that were accessible by anyone in the organization. And that was an especially big problem when the business decided that Copilot had to be rolled out. So luckily they had Varonis, and we helped them use automation to lock down all of that overexposure, all the 900,000 plus files with sensitive data. We locked it down to only those users who needed access in less than 10 days, and not a single user called the help desk complaining that their operations were impacted. We're only able to do that at scale effectively without impacting operations because we understand sensitivity, because we understand exposure and permissions, and because we understand historical activity. So we helped them lock everything down. They were able to confidently roll Copilot out, knowing that no sensitive data would be taken advantage of. And then post-deployment, they have us deployed to this day to make sure that exposure levels stay low, and that they're monitoring all of the prompts and data access via Copilot to detect if there's any unauthorized users or authorized users that suddenly start behaving in a not normal way.
No, I appreciate that. And you really have shared with us some very, very sobering stories for us to all consider, some of the risks that AI has introduced, and also some of the ways that adversaries now are using it, unfortunately, to their advantage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to share these insights. And for everyone who joined, at ICIT, we believe securing critical infrastructure requires rethinking old assumptions. And today's discussion on data-centric security demonstrates a different way to think about cybersecurity. So Daniela, with the last few minutes of our webinar time, is there one final thought or call to action that you want to leave the audience with?
And first of all, I appreciate the time with everyone today. And I would say just really encourage everyone here to evaluate, kind of how their organization is approaching AI security. Are they trying to restrict things? Are they proactively looking to lock things down? Just evaluate the way that you're looking at it and consider maybe how it aligns with some of the different risks and gaps that we talked about today. And my call to action, I think, would be, if the risks and gaps that we discussed today resonate with anyone listening, if Varonis's approach to solving these problems is interesting and you might like to learn more or try out a Varonis risk assessment, we love to talk and support you however we can. So just encourage you to reach out. We have a lot of success with the organizations we're working with, and hope to help many more of you in the future.
Well, thanks again. Thanks again to you, Daniela, and to Varonis for all these insights that you shared and the stories that you shared. And thanks again for everyone who joined this afternoon's discussion on what it takes to secure critical infrastructure in the age of AI. And we hope to see you at one of ICIT's next webinars. Have a good rest of the day.